And with that, I'd again like to welcome you into this space. We're thrilled to have you to share the information that we have to present with you today and to take some time to envision a better system of care for our communities. If you'd like, please in the chat include your name, pronouns, and the indigenous land from which you're coming from. If you're not familiar with that, I'm putting a link in the chat that you can use. And before we dive in, it's my pleasure to introduce the incomparable Chanel Portia Albert from Ancient Song Doula, who has generously allowed us to host this event on their platform.
Greetings, everyone. I'm really excited to be able to welcome you all here today for this very informative session on CAPTA CARA and just understanding how family surveillance has impacted individuals, families, and communities for generations. Ancient Song finds this topic to be really near and dear to our hearts as doulas who are oftentimes firsthand witnesses of the ways in which individuals have had their rights taken away from them and been criminalized for their choices. We stand in solidarity with everyone here who is working towards decolonized frameworks to really address the ways in which people have not been centered historically. And so I'm really excited to have you all here today and look forward to us learning and sharing. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Miriam Mack, pronouns she, her. I'm policy counsel to the Family Defense Practice at the Bronx Defenders. Today, we're going to go through a lot of things here. We're going to cover a lot of ground, so we're really excited. First, we're going to start with the history of the family regulation system's policing and punishment of pregnant and parenting people who use drugs. We're going to do an intro into CAPTA CARA. We're also going to talk about test and report, the practice of test and report in New York City hospitals and the New York City Human Rights Commission investigation into this practice into 3 private hospital systems. And then we're going to do some visioning and visioning what true support looks like at the end. So we are excited and we're going to jump right in. Next slide. Before we do that, we want to make a quick note on terminology. In this space, we seek to root out stigmatizing language and challenge and really tear down the false narratives that have been built around the family regulation system and around people who parent and who use drugs. So instead of referring to the system as the child welfare system, as some of you may know it, we refer to it as the family regulation system, the family policing system, the family destruction system, because as we have heard from many of the people who shoulder the burdens and the harm of the family regulation system, there's no welfare or protection to be found. Instead of words like addict and drug abuser or junkie, we use person who uses substances and people who use drugs. Instead of using clean or dirty to talk about a toxicology, we name it as it is, a positive toxicology or a negative toxicology, or using drugs or abstaining from using drugs. Next slide. Similarly, we don't use the terminology addicted newborn, born addicted, crack baby, drug baby, as these were all terms that don't adequately describe what fetuses or newborns experience having being exposed to substances in utero. And they were also words and phrases created to stigmatize and criminalize people who are pregnant and or parenting and using substances. So instead, we refer to infants with neonatal exposure to whatever substance, infants experiencing neonatal abstinence syndrome, infants experiencing or exhibiting symptoms of withdrawal. Next slide. So to start, we want to make clear that the family regulation system is a system that surveils, punishes, and controls families. It's a system that functions from top to bottom as a system of surveillance, control, and punishment. And it continues to be and has long been shaped by drug war ideologies. When you zoom out on the family regulation system, certain things become clear about who it targets and how the system operates. As many of us know, the family regulation system disproportionately targets BIPOC folks. And when I say BIPOC, I mean Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And we know that the disproportionality is the starkest with Black and Indigenous people and poor folks. And like its sister policing systems, the criminal legal system, the deportation system, the family regulation system functions to maintain structural inequality and hierarchy. It's structured to ensure that certain folks continue to parent on the margins under the unyielding gaze of the government. The family regulation system regulates and criminalizes the lives and existence of BIPOC folks and poor folks. And I say this, when I say this, I mean that specific alleged parental behavior or an alleged parental failing does not necessarily predict who is enmeshed in the family regulation system. Critical to understanding this or predicting this is actually the identity of the person who's engaged in this specific alleged behavior. So what we will talk about today specifically is substance use. Substance use is one of the largest drivers of families into the family regulation system. And we know there's mountains of data showing that people of all races, whether they're Black, white, Indigenous, Latine, whatever, use substances at largely the same rates. Yet we know that the people who are dragged into the family regulation system based on allegations of substance use are largely Black, Indigenous, Latine, and poor folks. Next slide, please. So one of the sort of foremothers of the critical analysis of the family regulation system, in addition to the families and activists who have long been resisting the family regulation system, is Dorothy Roberts. If you're not familiar with her work, you should look her up. And Dorothy Roberts has said that the family regulation system is an integral part of the US carceral regime. Regulating and destroying Black, Brown, and Indigenous families in the name of child protection has been essential to the ongoing white supremacist nation building project as much as prisons and police. And we'll learn more about this when Endra talks to us about CAPTA CARA. But next slide, please. So how did we get here? This is not accidental. Instead of funding Black mamas, the US funded the war on drugs. Since the early 1980s, the US government has been defunding Black mamas and investing in the war on drugs. And as you can see here from an image from the Movement for Family Power Ground Zero report, from 1982 to 2003, the federal drug control funding increased by 400%. Next slide, please. During that same time, the government chose to divest from Black communities and fund the family regulation system. And to be clear, this was a political choice, and it continues to be the choice that the US government makes. From 1982 to 2003, federal funding for removing children from their homes increased by 20,000%. And in fiscal year 2011, of the $6.5 billion of federal funds, Title IV-E funds, spent on the family regulation system, and Title IV-E is the largest funding stream of money allocated for state family regulation systems, 51% went to the foster program and 35% went to the adoption assistance program. And even when we look at the recent shifts that direct more funding to prevention services, services that are provided to families before the child has been removed from the home, those prevention services are services that are deeply invested in modifying the behavior of parents, as opposed to providing material resources that all families need to support their families. And also with those prevention services that are deeply invested in behavior modification, they also come with the surveillance and control and punishment of the family regulation system. And these shifts are in the face of mountains of evidence that show what BIPOC parents have been saying for years. Families know how to take care of themselves. They just need access to the material resources necessary to do so. We know that increasing the minimum wage corresponds with a reduction of family regulation system involvement, especially with reports involving children ages 0 to 5. We know that the availability of the earned income tax credit benefit corresponds with lower reports of what the family regulation system names neglect. We know that housing insecurity has a whole host of collateral consequences that affect families negatively. And research also shows that stable housing plays an important role in folks' ability to address substance use disorder. Yet we invest in the family regulation system. Next slide, please. So to support this project of surveillance and control and punishment, the government and media worked in concert to create and perpetuate narratives of Black maternal dangerousness and inadequacy. Throughout the 80s and 90s, media outlets saturated viewers with racially coded stereotypes about cocaine kids and crack babies. And these articles normatively cast parents who use drugs while pregnant as selfish and morally corrupt and even evil. And though the basis for these so-called, the scientific basis for these so-called crack babies studies have been debunked, and publications like the New York Times have retracted and even apologized for their own role in perpetuating these inaccurate and harmful and incredibly racist policies. These narratives are still alive and well today in the family regulation system and used as a basis to separate millions of Black and brown poor families. Next slide. And so this is an excerpt from the New York Times story and apology regarding its role in perpetuating the narratives around, the false narratives around pregnant folks and postpartum people who use drugs in their children, from slandering the unborn, stating the myth of the crack baby crafted from equal parts bad science and racist stereotypes was debunked by the turn of the 2000s. But by then, the discredited notion that cocaine was uniquely and permanently damaging to the unborn had been written into social policies and legal code. By the time the epidemic was over, the view that the fetus was a person with rights superseding the mother's had gained considerable traction in practice. Next slide, in practice. Next slide, please. And to be clear, medical professionals and healthcare providers have been complicit in the construction of this narrative and carrying out the effects of this narrative. Consistent with the trends in racial disparities throughout the family regulation system, poor Black, Latina, and Indigenous pregnant people and their newborns are disproportionately targeted by hospitals for drug tests, regardless of whether they meet hospital guidelines for those tests. A major way that new parents and newborns come to the attention of the family regulation system is through hospitals and medical providers. Specifically, when Black and Latina and Indigenous pregnant people give birth, they are routinely drug tested without their notice or consent, and those positive results are routinely reported to the family regulation system. There's often no medical explanation or reason given or recorded in the medical records for why the test is necessary, and often there's no medical treatment offered or performed on the pregnant person, postpartum person, or newborn if in the event of a positive toxicology, positive drug test. As such, hospitals serve as true sites of surveillance for the family regulation system. And this is significant because it means that the family regulation system's targeting of Black, Latina, and Indigenous families is embedded with the very social service systems tasked with helping families. And for more writing and analysis on this, I would suggest checking out the research of Dr. Kelly Fong. We'll drop her CV in the chat if folks are interested in looking into her research more. Next slide. So medical complicity in the criminalization and subjugation of Black and Latina people is not new, nor is the resistance to this criminalization and substandard care. In 1970s, here in the Bronx, the Young Lords took direct action against Lincoln Hospital, known locally as the butcher shop. And the young lords made several demands on Lincoln Hospital, from demanding better care and cleaner facilities to demanding that Lincoln Hospital create a clinic that would provide methadone maintenance assistance for community members of the Bronx. The young lords also established the People's Program, which among other things offered tuberculosis, lead poisoning, and iron deficiency anemia tests to Mott Haven neighborhood residents. Another example is the Black Panther Party, who in fact inspired much of the young lords' resistance and organizing. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, the Black Panther Party opened free medical clinics in Kansas City, Chicago, Seattle, and many other cities throughout the United States. These clinics provided first aid and basic services such as childhood vaccinations, screenings for high blood pressure, screenings for lead poisoning, tuberculosis, diabetes, and many other things. Next slide, please. So now we are going to play a short film about the young lords takeover of Lincoln Hospital. Please bear with us because we want to make sure that the closed captioning and the video speed are correct. So we're going to start it and then have to restart it. So bear with us, please.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We look now at an extraordinary new documentary called Takeover that follows the 12 historic hours, July 14th, 1970, when members of the Young Lords. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We look now at an extraordinary new documentary called Takeover that follows the 12 historic hours, July 14th, 1970, when members of the Young Lords took over the rundown Lincoln Hospital in the South Bronx. The Young Lords were a radical group founded by Puerto Ricans modeled on the Black Panther Party. They drove out the administrative staff of the hospital, barricaded the entrances, made their cries for decent health care known to the world. This is the trailer to the film Takeover.
This is a story from New York, not the New York of Manhattan, Broadway, but from perhaps the toughest square mile in the city, in the South Bronx.
I was 14 years old when I joined the Young Lords. The Young Lords were a street gang that became politicized by the Black Panther Party.
We became visible as servants of the people.
One of our targets was Lincoln Hospital.
That building was condemned 25 years ago. Condemned for rich people and opened up for poor people.
It was a place that you went to die.
Lincoln was called the butcher shop.
Blood stains on the walls, blood stains on the floors.
And there was a rat in the emergency room.
We have seen children get lead poisoning while hospitalized at Lincoln Hospital.
So we felt now is the time for us to say exactly how we're going to respond to the killings of our people.
Our plan was to take over Lincoln Hospital.
We have to begin to stand up as the people, the Puerto Rican people, and say that's enough. That's enough.
We've been asking for changes to take place, and you've paid no attention to us. You've thrown us out of your offices, and you've called the cops on us. Now we're putting you out. We've taken over a hospital. We're gonna run it. You're out. And I will walk you to your car.
We immediately announced that we were not leaving until the city made a firm commitment to build a new hospital.
From El
So now I'll pass it to Indra to talk to us about CAPTA CARA. Thanks, Indra.
Thank you, Miriam. I'm Indra Lucero, they, them pronouns. I'm the director of Elephant Circle. And first, I want to just demystify the knowledge I'll share about CAPTA and CARA. I am a licensed attorney in Colorado, but this isn't the kind of information that I learned in law school. I learned it because I was faced with pregnant people who were being drug tested and then being mistreated by the family regulation system. And I was hearing from them and providers that there was this federal requirement that they be drug tested. And I was curious about that, wanted to figure out what was going on. And in fact, just finding the law and reading it, I discovered that people's understanding of CAPTA and CARA didn't coincide with what the law actually says. As we've seen from the presentation so far, the current policy environment is not natural. It didn't come together thanks to thoughtful people working to do what's best for those most impacted. The family regulation system has a lineage. Values and beliefs that have existed for hundreds of years informed the creation of today's system at every level. Next slide. So of course, slavery is one of those cornerstones. It was many things, including a family regulation system. Next slide. After this country formally ended slavery, many of its key values nonetheless continued into the 20th century, escorted by eugenics. Eugenics was not only a sort of pop science movement of the time, but also a policy platform. And they succeeded in advancing many laws and policies across the country, regulating families and reproduction in a way that we see clear echoes of today. Next slide. You may have heard in the news recently about discoveries of unmarked graves of Native American children who were removed from their families and taken to indoctrination camps, also known as boarding schools. At every level, colonization is a family regulation system. Next slide. Of course, we're not the only ones noticing these echoes in today's policies. The former administration's policies are directly descended from this lineage. Though I would note that Native American children were removed from their families prior to 1870. The 1870s marked the beginning of a shift toward a particular policy of indoctrination. Next slide. In more recent history, we come upon a policy crossroads in the 70s. We see this crossroads in the drug war, but also in the family regulation system. On both fronts, there was a choice. We could have moved toward decriminalization and did not. And we know the consequences of that choice. And when I mean it was a tangible choice in the 70s, there was data, there were groups, there was support for decriminalization. And as you know, as a country, we went a different direction. Similarly, we could have gone in a more anti-poverty direction with the Comprehensive Child Development Act, but did not. And instead, we got CAPTA. So let me talk a little more about this. Next slide. The Comprehensive Child Development Act was not just possible, it was legislation that actually passed. It had bipartisan support. It passed both chambers in 1971, but it was vetoed by Richard Nixon. You can see what the Comprehensive Child Development Act would have done. It would have provided direct support to families that essentially put more money in their pockets. But the move to veto this law that had been passed aligned nicely with the spirit of slavery, colonization, and eugenics policies that had come before. To the extent that today's reports to the family regulation system are largely categorized as neglect, and not abuse, that just underscores that poverty is the real problem. And the Comprehensive Child Development Act could have helped, but that's not the policy choice that was made. Of course, after the Comprehensive Child Development Act was vetoed, there was still political will to do something for children. Next slide. Instead of a policy approach that directly helps families, 3 years later, Congress passed CAPTA, the Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act. CAPTA is a much more narrow approach to addressing children's needs. CAPTA funds state infrastructure for regulating families based on the idea that the best way to help kids is prevent child abuse through surveillance and punishment of families. This approach provides no direct benefit to families or kids. It aims to prevent, assess, investigate, prosecute, and treat child abuse through state infrastructure. I can't emphasize enough that this was a choice. CAPTA is where mandatory reporting comes from. It's the federal law that requires states who want some of this small pot of money to have mandatory reporter laws. And you can see mandatory reporting's lineage in how we got here. Next slide. So today, CAPTA is a grant program to states. To get funds, states have to show the federal government their plan for complying with CAPTA. This section of the law that we're interested in starts with the phrase, to be eligible to receive a grant under this section, ... It's mostly been a small amount of money, inadequate even to prevent, assess, investigate, prosecute, and treat child abuse. But concerningly, funding has been increasing. This is concerning partly because of what Miriam talked about. That increase of funding is a choice to resource state surveillance infrastructure instead of resourcing families. Next slide. As you can see by now, the drug war intersects well with this policy approach. And in response to the false panic provoked by headlines like these, an amendment to CAPTA was passed in 2016. This amendment is known as CARA, the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act. It's not surprising based on this history what CARA does and does not do. Next slide. So by 2016, the drug war was already known as a failure. So this policy has some of that ambivalence built into it. This is clear mainly in how the word illegal was removed from the category of substances at issue, especially since alcohol could not be ignored with regard to effects at birth. But when I read these sections compared to the older parts of CAPTA, I see these provisions straining against and not fitting well within the infrastructure that CAPTA created.